Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Barry Blake, Associate Executive Director of SMI. I'm very pleased today to host this webinar with Kate Vitasek from Haslam College of Business, the University of Tennessee. Kate has been instrumental in this methodology called Vested, which the more I learned about it, the more I realized how beneficial it would be for the SMI community to hear about this and to learn a little bit about it. So with that, let's get started. Hey, Kate, I hope you're doing okay today, and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me and to share our research and learnings about our research at the University of Tennessee on vested, or sometimes referred to as vested outsourcing. So we've put together a pretty good agenda for the webinar for your group today. So why don't we just go ahead and dig in, and I'll share what the discussion topics are. First, I want to just give a very brief background about our research, why we did the research, what it is. Then I want to share the mindset. One of the key learnings from our research was that organizations approached their strategic partnerships with a very clear and definitive mindset. We call that what's in it for we. So I'll talk about the mindset and why it's so important and how we often get stuck in kind of a catch-22. Then I'll go into the meat of the webinar. I'll be around how does vested work, so the methodology. So if you're trying to create a strategic alliance or partnership, what would be my tips for you? And I have 5 rules that I'll share as part of the methodology. And as I go over that methodology, I'll give an example, a really brief example from our research and what we found and how companies are, why and how they apply that rule. Then I'll talk about, is vested right for you? It is not right for all of the types of relationships you have. I'll also be weaving in a couple of healthcare case studies. So we do have some healthcare case studies where organizations are just starting to pilot vested, so I want to share some of those. And then I'll leave you with a resource page on where you can learn more. So that's a little bit about our agenda for the webinar today. So first, what about our research? How did we even start with our research? Why did we even do this? The research actually was originally funded by the United States Air Force and the Department of Defense. If you think about strategic relationships, strategic partnerships, the Department of Defense and the Air Force do a lot of very strategic deals, especially when it comes to things like maintenance and logistic support of their weapon systems. They buy this, huge, expensive aircraft or ship, and then how do we maintain that? Because there's not a lot of suppliers that can, maintain the GE 404 engines. Who's best to maintain them? And so how do you actually create these relationships that are sustainable, that are driving good value for the government? And that was a request. Is there a better way to work with these very large strategic deals? Many of these deals in the billions of dollars range in terms of how much money they were spending with the suppliers. And sometimes strategic partnerships aren't even about a supplier relationship. They're more of a peer-to-peer type relationship. So how do you get those to work? That was a little bit about our research and why it was originally funded. It first started in 2003. We did research between 2003 and 2009, and that work led to our first book, which is called Vested Outsourcing: 5 Rules That Will Transform Outsourcing. And that's really what I want to share most about today is the methodology from that original research. What is vested? But since then, we've had several other books come out talking about the when, the why, the what, and even how you would think about negotiating these kinds of deals. So let's dig in. What is vested? So when we say that word vested, I always ask when I'm doing keynote presentations or when we have our executive education folks come to our university, what does that word mean? And you get a lot of different words. Sometimes people say, wow, it kind of reminds you of having a 401k. You're invested, long-term, you're together, you're working, it's a win-win. And those are all right words. So when we think about what and how we teach vested, it's really four things. First and foremost, it's a mindset. It's a mindset to use, again, what we call a what's in it for we philosophy. And when you have that together, we mindset, what it does is enables value creation or pie expansion and pie sharing. So this is where we get the thinking behind win-win, right? So the win-win economics. So we have to come with this idea that I'm going into this partnership and it's not just a win for me, it also has to be a win for my strategic partner. So next, it's a methodology. As I mentioned, there are 5 rules and there are 10 contractual elements. You know, strategic partnerships, unless you're, jotting something on the back of a napkin or a PowerPoint slide, really should be minted or cemented with some kind of a formal relationship, usually a contract. So there are 10 things, 5 rules and 10 things that we would want to see in these relationships. And then it is a business model. Because when you formally and you do a good job of following the methodology, you create this model where this system where the two parties drive innovation and creates transformational results. I mean, isn't that why you're in a partnership to begin with and these strategic alliances? It's because you want innovation, you want transformation, you want something better than you have today. It's not just this transactional type of relationship. And lastly, we like to think of it as a movement because every year we start to see more and more organizations piloting and doing vested deals. So when we first came out with our first book in 2010, we had 2 companies, Dell and Intel, pilot that year. Today we have 57 companies that have done vested deals, including some healthcare organizations that have piloted. We have, for example, the Canadian government in healthcare has done now 3 deals. Telia, which is a Swedish telco, has done 5 deals. So the more people get comfortable with that it's a different model for partnerships, the more they use the model, the more they get comfortable with the model, and it's growing and expanding, which is exciting to see. So let's move into the mindset. So we've covered a little bit about our research. We call this what's in it for we mindset. And we get that phrase or that slogan because when you look at detailed research around win-win, it's not something that we just made up at the University of Tennessee. It's not just something that we went out and when we were talking to the companies that we researched that they said, yeah, win-win, everyone's heard the phrase win-win. And what makes it different in these deals that are super successful is that they not only say win-win, they craft partnerships that are win-win, all the way down to the contractual details. Very common that you see organizations say win-win or partnership, and then you start to look at the contracts, especially in a supplier type relationship, a supplier partnership. Gosh, we're going to have this strategic alliance, a strategic partnership. And you look at the contract and it has a 90-day termination for convenience. It has, all those little clauses in your contracts that are very transactional and arm's length. How can you have an alliance or a partnership and then you actually contract for something transactional and traditional? And that is a huge disconnect in what we see as success and not success. Do you say win-win or do you really do win-win, right? Is everything you do in that relationship supporting that win-win nature? So I mentioned, University of Tennessee isn't the first person to think about win-win. Actually, some of the research, the best research actually dates back to the 1950s with a gentleman named John Nash. Now, you might not remember John Nash for his economic prowess or the fact that he won a Nobel Prize in 1994, but he was made famous in the movie The Beautiful Mind. And if you look at the essence of his research, right, he basically says that when we have a strategy, the best approach, the most optimal mathematical way we can get the best results out of that strategy is to consciously choose to cooperate. And when we move away, when we say we're going to have this relationship and then we do things different, we change our mind, oh, here's a partnership, but here's my contract that's different. Oh, here's a partnership, but I'm switching out I'm bringing in the A team for the C team because it's cheaper for me, right? So when we waiver, you get less results, right? And so we know this win-win. So I have here our strategic partnership. We consciously choose to cooperate, and that's where we get a win-win. But when we do anything less than that, you're actually mathematically sub-optimizing your results. So when one party cooperates and another commands, right, we get a win-lose. When we both command, we get a lose-lose. Now, why do we fall into this trap, right? We sat at a dinner table and we had a wonderful strategy on the back of the napkin, but then sometimes we now have to put this strategic partnership into practice. And so all those great win-win thinkings go through corporate policies, go through contracting, go through how you execute. Well, I don't have time to put a dedicated person associated with that relationship. Whatever the reasons are, budgets, various things. So you say one thing and then you do something different. And the telltale sign here when we study these strategic relationships is looking at the contracts. They all had great intent, but what they contracted for was far less than the intent of that strategic relationship. And that's something I really want you to think about, after you hang up. If you just one thing to take away is, am I really doing strategic partnerships? Because if you're not really living into the intent of that relationship and you haven't designed it the way it should work, if you don't have all the right design principles, it won't work as well. And that's what our research finds, right? That you must be able to design these partnerships properly. And that's what we're going to get into the rules in just a little bit. So let's look at the vested approach, right? So both parties are literally vested in each other's success. A win for you is also a win for your partner, right? A win for the partner is a win for you. And think about it in terms of a supplier relationship, right? So we need a supplier to come in and do these great things, or even the labor services, Island Health, Vancouver Island Health. So the west coast of the Canadian government has doctors that perform a special task. They're called hospitalists. They perform the most complex of all of the doctor services for the Canadian government. For these very complex patients, the elderly, these hard stuff. They get all the hard ones. These are very specialized doctors called hospitalists. So the Canadian government had a contract, a labor services contract with their doctors. Well, can they just go fire their doctors, right? No, not really, right? So in essence, they needed to have more of a partnership philosophy, just because they were treated like, I'm the buyer, you're the doctor, right? And we're going to have this union contract. Well, when you say your doctors are valuable and strategic and can drive innovation, but you treat them as a labor union, and it's about billable services per hour, you're going to get billable services per hour. So let's look at my little graph here, right? And so in a vested relationship, let's just use buyer and supplier, because that's just easy to get, right? So on the left-hand side, I have the buyer, right? And their job is to specify the outcomes. What are the business things I'm trying to accomplish out of this? And they're going to prioritize their internal efforts. And on the right-hand side, we have our supplier, right? And their job is to develop solutions. They should be motivated to improve processes and decrease costs, right? So we need to craft these deals where we win together and lose together. It's not just about, here's billable fee for service, or here's a scope of work. What are you going to charge me? What's your price, right? It's not us versus them. It's really about putting both parties in the same boat and rising the boat together or lowering the boat together. So that win-win is also a lose-lose. Think about that. Right? If you've really crafted a good win-win deal, it is also a lose-lose. So we win together, we lose together. And this is where we start to see deals fall short, because they get win-win, but then in their contracts and the way they work is when things get tough, we don't want to lose. So we go, shift the risk and screw the other guy. So we don't like that lose-lose, but the best way to get these deals to work is actually to craft them as a system where you're winning together and you're losing together. So now, let's say the supplier, right? The less they use, the more profit they make. Wow, I'm going out and I actually, if I can make patients healthier, if I can make, have less infections, if I can solve that problem, I make more money. If I'm more innovative, I make more money, right? If I increase your revenue, I make more profit. And so you're creating this system where the supplier or your partner is literally vested in your success. When you win, they win. When they win, you win. And that's a real key to crafting these deals, is not just to say win-win and strategic alliance, but actually to craft them where they're working well. So let's move on, and we'll dig into the meat of today's webinar, which is, how does vested work? What's the methodology? What are these rules? And when you design these partnerships. So there are 5 rules. As I mentioned, our original book was called Vested Outsourcing. Today, actually a year or so into driving the education around this, we had so many organizations that go, well, I don't really outsource. I have strategic partnerships. So we dropped the word outsourcing, but it doesn't matter what kind of partnership you are creating. It doesn't have to be a buyer-supplier partnership. It can be any type of partnership. And we profile those in actually one of our books, these various types of partnerships. But let's look at the rules. What I'm going to do is break down each rule, and I'm going to explain why that rule is important, and I'm going to share one of our case studies that was in our book, Vested, How P&G, McDonald's, and Microsoft are redefining winning in business relationships. So I've just picked one example from the book. We had 8 case studies. I've picked 5 to kind of share. And then I'll end with how this is being applied in healthcare. So let's look at rule number 1, outcome-based versus transaction-based business model. So in a vested relationship, we move away from this transactional philosophy. So every dollar or every unit, every shipment, every patient, every billable hour, every task, every phone call, every shipment done, right? So the world operates very heavily in this transaction-based philosophy where we are paying and generating value based on the task or activities that we do. So when we have this activity or transaction mindset, this philosophy for our business, we get on what I call a transaction treadmill. So I have a little picture here of a rat on a treadmill. So think about this in a buyer-supplier relationship. I'm sure most of you have customers or suppliers, right? So let's say it's a maintenance, for example, the Air Force, right? An engine maintenance contract for the GE 404 engine. Every time GE showed up and they spent an hour, they would get paid, right? So the more hours, the more payment. The more calls, the more payment, the more, right? You see what I mean, right? So we get on this transaction treadmill, and we need to get off of that and start to say, what are our business outcomes? What is it we're trying to achieve? Not what are the activities that we need. Yes, you need the activities. But if you don't ever say where you're going, you're not going to get there, right? So another way I like to think about this is that what's your Mount Everest? So what do you want out of this relationship? What is your vision? What are your 5 desired outcomes that you want to achieve? So when I look at the P&G Jones Lang LaSalle case study, that was we profiled. It's a public case study. If y'all want any of these, I can show where you can get these. But P&G and Jones Lang LaSalle's relationship was for facilities, real estate and facilities management. So if you think about this, facilities, really janitorial, is that really a strategic partnership? Do I need a strategic partnership to clean my facilities, right? And on the surface, you would say absolutely not. P&G had 600 suppliers that cleaned their facilities, that provided dining services. You know, why do I need a strategic partnership? And the CEO of P&G stepped back and he said, you know what? Could we create value out of some of these things that were just being very transactional today. So he chartered William Reeves, who was the head of Employee and Workplace Design and Delivery Services. He said, is there a better way that we could really get value from all of this money? We spend $1 billion in facilities management and dining services for our employees. How can we get more value? So William Reeves and a team of folks stepped back and they said, you know what, you're right. We want a supplier that can take charge of the buildings, not just take care of them. So what if we created a partnership? Yes, we can be very transactional today, but what if we actually had these outcomes, and what would they look like? And so P&G went on with Jones Lang LaSalle, their partner, to create 5 desired outcomes. Again, I like to think about these as the future. It's not the task that you're buying. It's the future of what you want to get out of that relationship. And those desired outcomes are anchored in the contract themselves. They're usually right up front, right? We're entering into the strategic partnership so that we can achieve, or at least try to achieve, these 5 desired outcomes. They're very important. And I love that word, desired outcome. A desire is something you want, and an outcome is a business result, right? So you want these future business things. So those are the things that we find on the back of the napkin in those pretty PowerPoints, but they never make it into your contract. When you're doing the day-to-day work, they never make it into the day-to-day policies, process, procedures, right? We instead get back to those activities and we get stuck in that activity trap. So if you want a strategic partnership, you should be doing it for a reason, that you want something bigger than what you can have together. So what is your Mount Everest, right? How are you going to actually manifest that throughout the relationship, all the way into the contract, into the money, into the governance?
Kate, can I ask a question about that?
Yep.
Yeah, no, it's a super interesting point, and I'm just wondering, when you are deciding on what your objectives are, I imagine they have to be almost co-objectives with your supplier or with your partner or your customer, right? You might have objectives and they might not have objectives. So before you even get into that contracting phase, have you kind of already aligned on what those objectives are?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we actually couple the contracting phase with the process. So even if you've got something on the back of a napkin, that's just a fun thing to do. Now you go get a cross-functional team who's going to manifest that. So it is done together. Everything is done together in a cross-functional team. So I talked about the Canadian government, the Island Health, and their hospitals, right? They have 12 individuals and 2 attorneys that attended workshops. So the first workshop is around that Rule 1. What are the outcomes? And you actually have a formal shared vision. So you create a shared vision, you create your desired outcomes, and you actually do more than that. You create what's called a statement of intent. And the statement of intent is the guiding principles and the behaviors that you want to uphold as part of this partnership. Because one of the mistakes that people have is, again, they say these strategic partnerships, but then they behave in ways that are not strategic, right? Dell, for example, wow, you're my strategic partner, but I'm going to bid you out every 3 years. Island Health, right? Oh, you're my doctors, you're my strategic doctor group on how we manage these high-end cases. But I'm going to have a union contract, and we're going to negotiate the billable hours every 2 years, every 3 years. And so we tend to say one thing and do something else. So now this statement of intent becomes the anchor of your relationship. It's actually embedded in the contract right up front. In Island Health, it's on the first page. It's on the very first page. It covers page 1 through 3, the intent and the relationship.
Fantastic. Thank you for that.
Perfect. So rule number 2 is focus on the what, not the how, right? So if I'm going to buy outcomes, I can't write a traditional statement of work, right? I actually have to write something a little bit more loose. Because think about this. If I say I want to buy the future, I want to create this partnership for the future, and then I write down the scope of work that's identical to the way I've done it today, you're going to contractually obligate your partner to do it today. And that seems, it's actually one of the harder things for organizations to do is and P&G called it learning to let go, right? Because if they know how to do it today, you have to walk away from today and say, that's great. I want you to do it the way we're doing it today, but I want you to come to work every day and challenge today. Challenge the way we're doing it, because if we're not challenging it, we're not going to get better, faster, cheaper. So this is why I have a picture of a square watermelon. And this is a real picture. This is in Japan, right? And in Japan, the retail stores, the grocery stores are very, very small, and they don't have a place to put a whole pallet of watermelons, because watermelons are big and round and they're hard to ship. So you put them in a big crate, right? Well, that big crate's heavy and you need a forklift. Well, the retail stores in Japan don't have the footprint, the equipment to manage these big shipments of watermelons. So they needed watermelons one at a time, just-in-time delivery. That's kind of the way they do their logistics there. And so because they couldn't ship one watermelon at a time, it was big and round, they didn't sell watermelons, but people wanted watermelons. So the farmers in the grocery stores kind of got together and said, how could we solve this distribution problem? And they created how to grow a square watermelon. So true story. And now they can put the square watermelon in a box, and it's shipped super easy. It's very efficient. And so you want to not put your supplier in a box. You want them to think outside of the box. And that means challenging the statement of work. So here I have a case study on the Rocky Flats closure project. Now, this was the Department of Energy, and the supplier was Kaiser Hill, right? So Kaiser Hill was an engineering firm, and they were asked to come in and close and clean up Rocky Flats. So on the right here, I have a picture of the Rocky Flats campus. It was 800 buildings, 6,400 acres in the foothills of Denver, Colorado. And many of y'all might remember this. It was the site of the world's worst fire, industrial fire. It was toxic. It was in the news all the time if you were in Colorado. And no one had ever really cleaned up a site like this. And so they literally didn't know how to do it. Down below, look, this is some of the containers of the radioactive material. So you're asking a supplier to come in and do things that have never been done before, but yet still be safe, still have environmental compliance laws, right, that you want to uphold to. So they, just like Rule 1, right, they followed Rule 1 and they had desired outcomes: closed, clean, cost. Here's our budget. Can we come in under budget, right, and safe? So can you figure out how to do this? Close it as fast as you can, as safe as you can, as cheap as you can, right? So how do we do that? So if you wrote a statement of work, right, of the way it was being done, and this had actually happened, right? They had two suppliers. They'd gone through a bid process and found suppliers. Supplier 1 is going out to do the work exactly the way they were told. At the pace they were going, it was going to take 75 years. So what do? You fire the supplier and get a new one. Obviously, the supplier's not smart. You're going to bring in the smarter one. So you bring in a new supplier, and what happens? You give them the statement of work. It's going to take 75 years. So the Department of Energy said, well, maybe the enemy is us, and maybe the suppliers really are smart, and we should not constrain them in the details of how it's done today, because the way it's been done today is taking 75 years. So if you look, these are actually words right out of their contract. Seek ways to accelerate cleanup action, eliminate unnecessary tasks and reviews, work together, be flexible, be open to modifying the work scope and schedules, because priorities change. We find things that we didn't even know we had. And I cannot make this up. They found 76 contaminants in the Rocky Flats site that had never been known to man before, because chemicals get mixed with chemicals and it makes new mixtures of things, right? And they're like, wow, we've never done a cleanup on this thing. So they had to be very flexible. And by allowing that flexibility into the relationship and embracing it, they created over 200 innovations that got Rocky Flats, instead of 75 years billion. That was the baseline from two previous suppliers. 75 years, $37 billion. They came in at 10 years and $7 billion, saving $30 billion in 65 years of time. But they had to let go, right? They had to say, I don't know how to do this. I want to buy innovation. So when we innovate, there were incentives, which I'll get to in a little bit, right? That's actually rule 4. How to reward the supplier for bringing these innovations. For example, this innovation down here in the corner, this is a glove box. There were 1,476 glove boxes. The previous baseline for cleaning up and decontaminating a glove box was 1 year per glove box. 1 year. Kaiser Hill got it down to 3 days. 3 days. And it was by innovations and trials, right? So let's look at rule number 3, clearly defined and measurable desired outcomes. So if I'm going to focus on outcomes, business results that are mutually defined for both of us, right? And they have to be mutual, because if it's just for you, the buyer, what's in it for the supplier? They're just a service provider then. They're not a partner. They're just a, labor for hire. So if you're going to have these mutually defined outcomes, how are you going to measure success? And I love this quote from Yogi Berra. You've got to be careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. So let's go back to my back of the napkin. We have these business meetings and, the back of the napkin, the beautiful PowerPoint slides that say our strategy. And then you go put in metrics. And you look at the metrics, and they are measuring tasks. They are measuring activities. So no wonder you don't get the future. You are measuring today, right? And so again, there's another disconnect from what we say and what we do. So we want this to go all the way down into the contract. So my example here is the Minnesota Department of Transportation and Flatiron Manson, who was the construction partnership who came in to rebuild the Minnesota Bridge. Now, the bridge fell down in 2007. This is what it looked like. It was a bad day for the state of Minnesota. And the governor said, I want a bridge by December 24, 2008. Now, the bridge fell down August 1st, 2007. This was not even going to be 18 months later. They had no money. They had no budget. They had no plan. They had no design. They didn't have a supplier. People thought the governor was nuts. How are we going to do this? And by setting this clear, measurable, and there were, by the way, this wasn't the only measurable. There was a few others, right? Again, if you're going to have these outcomes, how are you going to measure the outcomes? So for each one of these outcomes, there was a goal. And he said, go figure it out. Because if you use the same methodologies that we've always been doing, it takes 5 years to get a bridge. And we can't have our main transportation thoroughfare. This was an interstate. We couldn't have this down. And he said, I'm going to be bold and I'm going to challenge you guys to go figure it out. And here's how we're going to measure success. Right? And they actually did that. So the bridge opened on September 17th, 2008. It fell down on August 1st. It was open. It was open under budget, ahead of schedule. No one had ever built a bridge as fast. People thought, well, it's got to be bad quality. It won tons of design awards. It won over a dozen design awards from the construction industry. And again, they thought about the outcomes. They challenged how they were doing things. They were very clear in the metrics. So you start to see how these rules build. They're creating a system. What do I want? I gotta challenge you to be innovative to get there, and I need to measure the success of the future, not just measure today. So these rules start to build or create your system. So the fourth rule in your system is a pricing model with incentives to optimize the business. So I have here a picture of James Watt's steam engine. And a lot of people say, well, why do you have a picture of a steam engine for pricing models, right? It has nothing to do with price. Well, many of you probably know that the steam engine was deemed as one of the machines that changed the world, right? So it really brought in the Industrial Revolution. But many of you probably don't know that James Watt's patent expired. And so he had an investor, and the investor pulled out. Why would the investor make an investment in James Watt and his idea for innovation if there was no hope of a future return? So James Watt just was so adamant that his steam engine could do amazing things for society. He kept making the journey from Glasgow down to London to meet with Parliament to get his patent expired. And after several visits, they finally said, okay, we will extend your patent. And then and only then could he get a new investor. So the moral of the story is, why would anyone invest in innovation if there's no hope of a future return? So we need to create in a win-win model. It's called pie expansion, right? So we work together to expand the pie. Well, you have to share the pie, and this is hard. So again, people say win-win and pie expansion, and then you look at the money, and the money is not being shared in an equitable way. And that doesn't mean 50-50, right? But what is fair? And usually the party with the more power, often in a buyer-supplier relationship, the buyer isn't fair to the supplier. The buyer is looking at a price instead of incentives. Well, if you're looking at a price, the supplier is going to look at a price and sell you the innovation. Well, I can do that, but it's going to cost you. And so we're not really working together to expand the pie and share the pie. So we have to move from this price mentality to a pricing model. And that pricing model has to have incentives that when the parties achieve their desired outcomes, they climb their Mount Everest, that value that's created is shared. So we expand the pie, we share the pie. So my analogy here is Microsoft and Accenture. So, price is something you would go to Starbucks and pay $3.57 for your Grande 2-pump vanilla latte, right? A pricing model is really an economic model that models the business. When we win together, what does that look like? When we lose together, what does that look like? How does that link up to our metrics? So the higher we climb our Mount Everest, the more incentives there should be. The more value that's created, the more value we need to share. So how are you actually making that leap from price to pricing model, right? And in a buyer-supplier relationship, people are so ingrained in the procurement process that it's a hard time for them to get out of their head this price and really to start thinking about it from an economics perspective. A good partnership brings economics to the deal, not price. We win together, we lose together. There's risk. How do we share risk? How do we mitigate risk? Mitigating risk is actually a value creation opportunity. So if we can work together to mitigate risk, how are we going to share that? And we're not very good as business people sharing. I think we forgot about that in kindergarten, right? So we have to reteach that philosophy of sharing when people come to our classes, because it's a tough one. So the last rule 5, is insight versus oversight governance. And we use this word oversight. We need oversight. Well, that connotes that you don't trust your partner. If you don't trust your partner, you probably shouldn't have a partnership. So think about that, right? If I don't trust you, why am I creating a partnership? So we need to move to insight versus oversight. This me versus you, us versus them mentality, it needs to go from me to we. And governance is really all of those mechanisms that you use every day, day in and day out, to manage the business. As I like to say, manage the business. Don't manage the supplier. Don't manage your partner. Manage the business together. So you need to be creating these governance mechanisms that are going to help you manage the business. So my favorite case study here is McDonald's. McDonald's has been doing very strategic partnerships with their supply chain partners for over 60 years. Actually, Ray Kroc founded the company and said, my strategic suppliers will be strategic. So he does not bid out the strategic suppliers. McDonald's doesn't, because that would be very transactional. And instead they say, you are my partner. But because you're my partner, I need you to help me create value for the business. And value for them is beating the competition. in any dimension, right? So, for example, who ran out of chicken during the Asian avian flu crisis? Not McDonald's, the chicken company, right? So their competitor, who sells mainly chicken. And so why did the suppliers support McDonald's when there was a shortage? Because they truly were a partner and not just a transaction. So if you're out there just buying, treating your partner as transactional, so I may call you a partner, but I still bid you out. I may call you a partner, but I still, have a termination for convenience. I can fire you just because, right? So McDonald's actually has what they call an exit, right? So face reality. You can't get out of these supplier relationships very easily. So how do you exit them, right? And so rather than a termination for convenience, what's your exit management plan? And because they are so committed to their partnerships, they very rarely have exits. They've only had 5 exits in the last 30 years. Their suppliers consistently outperform the market. So by not using the market, they actually get more. But you have to follow all 5 rules. Just one rule isn't going to work. The rules work together in a system. So, all right, well, any questions before I get into when is vested right for you? So I've kind of given you a lot of high-level thinking there and just a little bit of an example, but I tried to show at least one example. And the nice thing about these examples, they're all publicly available case studies. So you can pick up a book, you can individually, a lot of the case studies are individual case studies. We have 50 pages on the P&G and the Microsoft one. Or you can just pick up a book and glance through a book and read. But any questions on the methodology?
Kate, one did come in around the culture to this, like the idea that this model or methodology, it needs to work within a culture that may already exist. Changing that culture can be very difficult. I guess, can you talk a little bit about the culture change required for these types of relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, you have to have the right mindset. So if you aren't driving the right mindset and you're not putting in the mechanisms, so the mindset helps you say, I'm going to be different with this particular partner. You are not a supplier. Just think about just calling them a partner instead of a supplier, right? Now, where the rubber hits the road is when you rechange all of the mechanisms and how you work with that partner. Because we say partner, but then we put in the mechanisms to work with suppliers, right? And so we aren't retooling our system. We're using an old system, and so what's going to happen? People call that cultural change. It's not really culture change. You have to change the way you work. How can you can't just say one thing and then hope the organization's going to move along. So to us, cultural change is coupled with changing the mechanisms. If you don't change your mechanisms, you're never going to get the culture change. And you have to set that direction. And I have a really good example of that from Island Health, who did that. I mean, they were in a very bad place, a very bad place with their doctors. Had gone through horrible negotiations. They were out of a contract for almost 3 years. They were in lawsuits. It wasn't fun. And so how do you just one day go, well, you're now going to be our partner? They're like, you're nuts. We hate you, right? So how do you change that? You have to first at least start to say, we want to change. We want to change. We know we don't have the mechanisms. So let's get in a team. Let's put together a team and let's change all of the mechanisms and how we work. So don't blame each other. Blame the mechanisms.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. Yep.
So it's not anyone's fault that your culture is not supporting this. It's the fact that you don't have you aren't following the rules. You're cheating, right? So, and that's kind of funny because when people come in and they do these deals, they'll often come and they'll go, I really liked these people. I just thought I didn't. The contract made me do it. The contract made me be evil and cheat. So you have to recognize that your methodology is actually driving the way you work every day drives that culture. So you have to change the way you work. And there's a lot of other tricks in there too, which is we teach in our courses. So let's look at vested right for you. So vested is not for all deals, right? So, P&G has 80,000 suppliers. They can't possibly all have strategic. They can't all be strategic. There's not enough time and energy. So if you look at, there's actually 25 factors. We have what's called a business model mapping toolkit. But if you were to take those 25 factors and you were to put them into a nice little consulting 2x2, which many people like, business people like these, it really depends on dependency and risk and potential to create value. So the more dependency you have on your potential partner, the more you have risk, because it's shared risk, shared reward. You're doing something that has never been done before, right? So the more dependency, the more risk. And the more potential to create value, you want to shift along this sourcing, this continuum here, right? So what happens is we say we wanted these partnerships, a win-win vested relationship, but you look at the contracts and they're really usually down here. At best, they're here. So this is where we go in and we change. The team itself designs the new mechanisms following the rules. And they become contractual obligations because I don't want to just design it and then go, well, the new guy's in town and we're not going to do it. So your partner is making investments on your behalf. They want some assuredness that you're going to not cheat, right? So this is why the contract is so important, right? So if I look at it a different way, there's kind of a continuum. Right? And so some partnerships, for example, are up here in investment, right? So I'm doing a joint venture or whatever. You should still follow the same 5 rules because you can create a joint venture that has a bad culture because you don't have the mechanisms. But vested is really a good option when you don't want to actually physically invest and become a joint venture, but you need investment, right? But you still want to be separate companies, right? I'm going to have an alliance partnership. So you are following the rules, but it's not an investment. You're not creating a formal separate entity to do the work, right? You still have, each company doing their own thing. But what it does do is it shifts you up, right? It shifts you up here to having mechanisms that are towards investment, your shared risk, shared reward. Right, where most deals, we look at these strategic partnerships, and again, their contracts are hanging out down here. They say one thing and they do something different. So lastly, vested is a movement because it is growing. It is super fun to kind of be the academic that steps back here, and we started as research, and then we became educators to teach people how to do this, and to see companies every day, taking our classes, piloting these types of deals. So the case studies that I referenced are in a book called Vested, How P&G, McDonald's, and Microsoft Are Redefining Winning in Business Relationships. So this particular book has 8 case studies, 8 of our original case studies. But I want to go back and I want to point to healthcare because we are starting to see a great interest in healthcare. The first company to pilot vested was actually in South Africa. It was an insurance company called Discovery Health. And so the CEO read the vested outsourcing manual, and he said, I need my partner and I to work in this way. So they created a vested relationship with his claims administrator. So they have a claims administrative outsource provider who also does managed care. So it is pretty much a sole source relationship for claims and managed care. So it's a huge relationship. And if you look at how they have driven innovation through this partnership, this is their graph, not ours, right? Each year, they're driving more and more innovations, right? And so what that does is it's lowering the cost of Discovery Health. Well, when they lower their costs, they're a nonprofit. They lower their premiums. Well, then they get more people because they have cheaper and better insurance. Who wouldn't want to join Discovery Health? But they're doing it through innovation and through partnership, right? So that case study is public. Another one is Vancouver Coastal Health. So Vancouver Coastal Health is like Island Health. They're one of the health authorities on the west coast of Canada. So they did a pilot in 2015. And their case study is profiled in Contract Management magazine. And you can see it says the prescription for collaborative healthcare outsourcing. And so this is a great little article. And Barry, I don't mind sending this to you. You can send it to the readers if you'd like. But they became the first healthcare system to pilot vested in North America in more of a traditional healthcare. So not insurance outsourcing, but healthcare. And it was for environmental services. Particularly their Mount Everest was infection and infection control. So how do I work with a supplier to manage and mitigate the risk around infection controls? So since their pilot, the Canadian government has now done 3 deals. Our latest case study is Island Health, who I mentioned, with their doctors. Now, this was a union, a kind of a union contract, labor services. I don't think they use the word union, so labor services. These were headlines, right? So when they reached out to us, they'd heard about vested through Vancouver Coastal Health. And they said, look, we are stuck. We are without a contract. We hate each other. It's not pretty. And we heard your methodology can help us rethink our relationship. And we need something because it is not good. And so they brought in the University of Tennessee. A couple of us came down and hosted a workshop. And then they wound up engaging one of our adjunct faculty members to lead workshops where they did a complete redesign of their relationship and their contract. Remember, it's not just about what you're saying, it's about what you do in your contract. And so I love this chart here. This is, I don't know if you're familiar with a wordle, but a wordle is the adjectives, and each, when it has a bigger word, that means more and more people said that word. So if it's really tiny, then it's only one person said it. So distrustful, broken, dysfunctional, strained, adversarial, untrusting, terrible, toxic, manipulative, one-sided, and then 2 years after, so they went through the process to get to their contract, then they live into their new relationship and they live into their new contract, right? 2 years later, collaborative, respectful, trust, improved, supportive, caring, cooperative, night and day. So Kim Crone is the Vice President of Finance and Risk for Island Health, and Dr. Jean Maskey was the leader from the hospitalist. And they are on a mission to tell people about vested. One of the reasons why they allowed us to do their profile, their case study, because they're like, you know what, they said, we don't know that we could have gotten unstuck. And even if we'd have gotten to a contract, it would have been still anchoring us with these old mechanisms. And we probably neither would have been happy. And by really rethinking how we worked and putting it into a partnership perspective with desired outcomes and what are we going to do, it really helped them get out of this, not only rethink the relationship, but all the way manifested down to the contract. So that's a little bit about vested and what we're seeing in healthcare. Is there any questions or anything I can answer as we finish up for the webinar?
Yeah, Kate, that was fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing. I guess the question, perhaps the last question, the healthcare example, did you notice anything, and this is going to sound silly, did you notice anything different about the experience with the health system than some of the other case studies where vested has been implemented? Is there anything that was more challenging? Was it difficult for the parties to understand? Were there, I guess, other constraints that made it more of a challenge, or was it, there's a process, you follow that process, and whether you're healthcare, whether you're consumer goods, it works?
Yeah, it's actually the latter there. So if I go back to the book, right, P&G's facilities management, Microsoft business process outsourcing, McDonald's the supply chain, environmental services, construction, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're in healthcare. So a lot of people think, well, I'm in healthcare, I'm special. Well, Department of Energy would say, oh, nuclear environmental service, I'm special, right? Or IT would go, oh, I'm special. So everybody thinks they're special, but at the end of the day, you have a problem in that you are optimizing for yourself. So it's an economic problem that's universal. You know how to optimize for your world, but in today's world, you need a partnership, and all your mechanisms are anchored in optimizing for you instead of for both. So it's an economic problem that's universal.
Well, I love it. And again, thank you so much. You've shared a tremendous amount of detail. Audience, there's a number of resources that you can find in the link right there, thevestedway.com. Lots of tools you could use, etc. So I'd urge you to take a look. And Kate, thank you so much again. It was a pleasure working with you on this.
Well, thanks. And if anyone has any questions, just have them send me an email. I'm pretty responsive on email. Usually it's less than 48 hours, but usually within a day I'll get back. So.
Excellent. Thank you again. Bye, everybody.